When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army had over 20,000 tanks waiting for them. Over 7,000 of these were from a single family, the BT series. These were some of the fastest tanks ever built, armed with powerful 45mm guns, large engines, modern suspension systems, and even radios. Yet, by the end of July, just weeks after the Germans invaded, almost all of them were gone. Destroyed, abandoned, captured, gone. So what happened to the BTs? Why did this relatively advanced, modern vehicle perform well against the Spanish, Polish, and Japanese, but fail so spectacularly against the German panzer divisions in June 1941? Welcome to the design, development, and destruction of the BT fast tanks. To understand any of this, we need to, annoyingly, talk about an American, J. Walter Christie. Christie was an automotive designer with a reputation for bold ideas and bizarre publicity stunts. In the 1920s, he became obsessed with the concept of a convertible tank. Not a tank with a removable roof, but one that could switch between tracked propulsion and wheeled propulsion, allowing you the benefits of both with none of the drawbacks. His first two designs, the M1919 and M1921, weren't very effective, but in 1928 he unveiled the Christie M1928. This vehicle used 4 large road wheels in the middle, with a raised idler at the front and a drive sprocket in the rear. To convert the M1928, the tracks were removed and the vehicle sat on the 8 rubber-rimmed wheels. The rear set of road wheels were linked to the drive sprocket via a chain to provide power, and the front set could be steered like a regular car. What you're not seeing is the patented Christie suspension system. Large helical springs connected to each wheel, mounted inside the hull itself. The large wheels and the freedom of movement provided by the large springs allowed for an incredibly smooth ride, even if it did make it a little cramped inside. The new tank, or at least the hull, was revolutionary. Unfortunately for Christie, the US wasn't interested. But someone else was. The Soviet Union were trying to rapidly modernize their military, including their tank forces. After the US relaxed their export laws in the late 1920s, the Soviets were able to come and view some prospective purchases. In April 1930, they arrived at Christie's factory in New Jersey and saw the M1928 tank with their own eyes. They almost immediately placed an order for 2 vehicles for a combined $60,000. A later agreement gave the Soviets patent and license production rights for another $40,000. This may seem like incredibly bad business for Christie, but he was probably very aware they'd be copying his design regardless, so $40,000 is better than nothing. Christie, fearing that the US government wouldn't approve of the deal, eventually put through an export request in December 1930 for 2 commercial tractors, which was promptly signed. This is an image of the 2 slightly modified M1940 prototypes destined for the USSR, doing an excellent job of showing off how the Christie suspension system actually worked, but with something quite important missing from the top. This rebranding of the 2 tanks as tractors meant that Christie did not ship any turrets along with the tanks. The Soviets demanded, and eventually got, $25,000 back in compensation. But anyway, that's enough Americans for our Soviet tank video. Back in the USSR, the Soviets were working on how to adapt the M1940 into their own domestic design, ideally with a turret. This tank was to be known as the Fast Tank, or Bystrogodny Tank, BT-2. The BT-1 was likely the designation for the Christie prototypes within Russia. As one team attempted to fix the existing BT-2, another team developed the turret for the new vehicle. The plan was to produce 900 BT-2 tanks by the end of 1932. However, thanks to issues with some minor components, the armour, engine, tracks, wheels, transmission, turret and gun, this was somewhat delayed. The BT-2 entered service in 1932, and now that we have the new turret, we can assess the complete vehicle for the first time. The BT-2 was a 3-man 11-ton tank, with the driver sitting at the front of the vehicle under 15mm of front and side armour. In tracked mode, he drove the vehicle like a typical tank, using 2 control sticks that were connected to the transmission in the rear via mechanical linkages under his seat. When the tracks were removed, he fetched a steering wheel from a nearby storage bin and attached it to the steering column, which could then turn the front 2 road wheels. You'd then operate the BT like a car or a truck. All this was powered by an M5 petrol engine in the rear, which was a Soviet-produced version of the L-12 Liberty aircraft engine, a remarkably lightweight engine rated for 400 horsepower and connected to the drive sprockets via the transmission in the rear. The new 2-man turret up top housed the commander/gunner on the left and the loader on the right, and was designed initially around the French 37mm gun. However, plans soon changed to use the 37mm B3, a more modern gun based off the German 37mm. Soon it was discovered that the B3 and a coaxial machine gun could not fit into the original mountings together, and the coaxial had to be removed and replaced with a ball-mounted machine gun on the turret cheek. But as turret and hull production ramped up, there weren't enough B3 guns to go around, so on some vehicles dual DP-28 machine guns were fitted to the central mounting instead, leading to this quite silly arrangement of twin MGs in the centre with another ball-mounted MG off to the side. The turret also had around 15mm of all-round protection. Now, you may have clocked that the entire vehicle only had 15mm of armour at best. You might also have realised that that is a bit pathetic, and not enough to stop anything larger than a rifle bullet, and you'd be right. And it's easy to see, in hindsight, how vulnerable these vehicles were, but just look at the gun. The B3 37mm gun in the BT2 weighed around 250 kilograms. That, along with the fact that it was quite compact, meant that it could be carried by essentially any tank of the time period, and wheeled versions were pretty commonplace. This gun could penetrate 42mm of armour at 100 metres and 35mm at 500 metres. This is actually relatively low for the time period. In order to stand up to that sort of punishment, you need over 40mm of armour across the entire front arc of your tank, and don't get me wrong, this could be done. The French tanks of the time, like the R35 or the D1, could probably shrug off these rounds easily enough. But these were less tanks and more bunkers, having maximum speeds of 20 and 19 km per hour respectively. The BT, with its relatively thin armour, modern suspension and a large engine in the rear, was capable of speeds up to 5 times that, 100 km per hour on roads and 70 km per hour off-road. Christie and the Soviets had designed the BT on purpose as a cavalry tank. It was used to exploit gaps in enemy lines and cause chaos behind them, or rapidly redeploy to engage an enemy attack from a seemingly impossible direction. Using the battlecruiser mentality of speed is armour, the BT fit into this role extremely well. Think of it as an interwar version of the Leopard 1 or the AMX-30. That, and the fact that making armour plate is expensive and difficult, and it gets more difficult the thicker the plate is. The Soviets didn't have the expertise or the equipment to create thick armour plate at the scale they would need for the BT project, even if they wanted to, which, again, they did not. On paper, the BT looked impressive. In reality, the design had massive mechanical issues. The transmission wasn't mature, the suspension had teething troubles, and the Liberty aircraft engines, while light, were fragile, maintenance hungry, and prone to breakdown. But Soviet engineers were working on these issues, as well as the next vehicle in the BT series, the BT-5. Before we get on to the BT-5 though, I want to give you a little look into my creative process. First, I think of a great idea for a video. Then I do the research and write a charming, engaging script. Then I open Adobe Premiere Pro and let out a massive sigh. Listen, I'm bad at editing. I taught myself how to do it, and I do it all pretty manually, and it turns out that's actually quite stupid. And that's where Storyblocks comes in. Storyblocks is an all-in-one creative toolkit that helps me with the bit I struggle with, turning ideas into videos. On its simplest level, Storyblocks has a massive library of footage, music and sound effects that I can slot directly into my videos, including a lot of really high quality military stuff. But what I've been experimenting with, and I've used it in this sponsor section, is their selection of templates, pre-made animations, transitions and title cards that you can download and customize within Premiere. They've even got a Premiere plugin so you can browse from the app. Using these going forward, my videos are going to be nicer to look at and quicker to make, so that's a win-win. Their entire library is also 100% human-made, a bit of a rarity these days even on YouTube. So please, for the sake of higher quality videos, join me in using Storyblocks. For a limited time, you can head to storyblocks.com/RWF to get 15% off any annual plan. Discount is only available through my exclusive Red Wrench link. But what was I saying again? Something about an exciting new BT tank. The next major milestone for the BT series was the BT-5. See, the BT-3 was simply a BT-2, but built using metric measurements rather than imperial, while the BT-4 was a BT-2 manufactured using welds rather than rivets. Neither of these were adopted, so we skipped to 5. The key difference between the BT-2 and BT-5 is the gun. The BT-5 uses a superior 45mm tank gun, known as the 20K. This fired a larger, heavier round at slightly lower speed than the 37mm, with marginal improvements to armour penetration, but massive improvements to HE performance, nearly 5 times as much explosive filler per round. The The new turret with the 45mm was manufactured to be compatible with both the BT-5 and the T-26, which used the same gun. The hull is essentially identical to the BT-2, but with a number of mechanical issues ironed out. Everyone, by this point, had a better grasp on how to actually build a modern tank, and BT-5s started rolling out of their factories from January 1933. By this time, the Red Army was well on its way to adopting radios across many tank units, and radio-equipped BT-5s started being produced from the end of 1933, with sets displacing some ammo in their turret bustles. These can be distinguished from regular vehicles via their funny-looking clothesline antennas around the turret. The BT-7 was the next vehicle produced in the BT family, with the BT-6 being a failed project to add more fuel to the BT-5 design. Despite manufacturing 2,000 BT tanks in 2 years, which is insane by the way, the Soviets wanted more. But they couldn't make the M5 aircraft engines quick enough to make any more, so they opted to use a simpler, more rugged M17 petrol engine for the new vehicle, which would also attempt to incorporate all the changes from the shelled BT-3, 4 and 6. This meant that the BT-7 would be completely metric, with an all-welded hull, and had an extra fuel tank in the rear, while using a new engine and keeping the 45mm gun of the BT-5. Work was also being carried out on a fire support variant known as the BT-7A. This would eventually end up using the same turret and 76mm gun as the T-26-4. In 1937, as production ramped up massively, the BT-7, and by extension the T-26, got a new turret, with sloped sides increasing the armour protection ever so slightly. Vehicles with this turret were often referred to as the BT-7 Model 1937. However, the armour protection only went up from 15mm to about 17mm. It wasn't exactly a huge improvement. This is what prompted an engineer called Nikolai Siganov to create this, the BT-IS. The IS, of course, stands for Joseph Stalin. Nikolai basically attempted to modernise and improve the BT-5 design across the board. But, clearly frustrated that the BT-IS was not immediately put into production, Siganov wrote a letter to the Politburo accusing various higher-ups of being pests, fascists and foreign agents. This was a leading factor in the chief designer of the BT project, Afanasy Fersov, along with various members of his staff, being taken away and shot by the NKVD, putting the whole program into chaos. Our hero Siganov soon tried again though, with his BT-SV proposal. The BT-SV was inspired by the French FCM-36 and saw the BT tank completely redesigned with steeply sloped armour, offering protection against 45mm guns. As we discussed earlier, this made the BT-SV weigh 25 tons, so it would have lost essentially every advantage of the BT series for little gain. The BT-8 project was underway too, with the new vehicle using a diesel engine instead. This was eventually adopted as the BT-7M and would be produced throughout 1940. Other sillier variants of the BT series were also tested during the 30s, like the failed PT-1 amphibious tanks, the RBT-5 mounting 420mm rockets either side of the turret, the various flamethrower vehicles, the TT-BT-7 radio-controlled teletank, the SBT engineering vehicle, the KBT armoured personnel carrier, and even a proposal to attach the BT to a glider and fly it into battle. None of these saw widespread use. By this time, the BT series had already seen quite a lot of combat. Its debut was in Spain in 1937, with 50 BT-5 tanks serving in Republican tank units and first tasting battle on the 13th of October 1937. In June 1938, the BT would first see combat in Soviet hands, this time with BT-7s fighting Japanese troops on the Mongolian frontier. Their performance against the Japanese was actually quite good in these early engagements. And when fighting in the Far East resumed the next summer, the BT brigades were massively reinforced, with 510 BT tanks serving across 8 battalions as Soviet forces skirmished with Japanese cavalry and infantry units around the Khalkhin-Gol River. Just a month later, in September 1939, around 1,800 BT tanks would participate in the Soviet invasion of Poland. With the Polish army concentrated primarily in the west, the Soviet tanks saw little fighting, but were exposed to lengthy road marches during the campaign. Vehicles were often driving as far as 300 kilometers. What this meant was that many of these vehicles were operating at the very limit of their mechanical endurance, with engine and transmission components reaching the end of their lifespan and requiring rebuilt in factories that were now very, very far away. Also, these tank units were now, following the seizure of Poland and the Baltic states, stationed at old Tsarist military garrisons in the west that did not have adequate training or maintenance facilities for the tanks or the crew. The situation worsened in November 1939 as the Soviets invaded Finland, and following yet more road marches from Latvia and Lithuania, many BT units were sent headfirst into Finnish fortifications. The narrow tracks of the BT series really suffered in the dense snowy forests of the Finnish border regions, further exacerbating the numerous tactical issues. Many were lost completely, many were damaged and required repair, and even the so-called unscathed vehicles, almost all needed rebuilt or refurbished. The Finns actually captured so many BT tanks that they were able to put them into service in the Finnish army, operating BT-5 and BT-7 tanks as is, as well as adapting them into their own designs, like the BT-42 artillery tanks mounting British 4.5-inch howitzers, or the BT-43 transport vehicles. For context, the Liberty-powered BT-2 and BT-5 needed completely rebuilt after 450 hours of use. A BT-7 needed rebuilt after 600 hours. The Soviets in April 1941 had 7,500 BT tanks of all types, more than 2,000 of which were the older vehicles, and they just kept using them. For all their stupid wars, for publicity stunts, for parades, for filming propaganda pieces, it was always a BT tank going maximum speed over difficult terrain. We have footage of multiple BT tanks doing actual stunts, flying off massive ramps into ponds, or doing total wipeout-esque obstacle courses, which is madness. These were their frontline combat vehicles, and even in the best of times they struggled to keep these tanks running. As a result, in June 1941, the BT fleet was in a state of literal disrepair. An assessment of 3,063 BT tanks on the Western Front found that 9 were brand new, 2,604 needed minor repairs at unit level, 307 needed medium repairs at a repair depot, and 143 needed complete rebuild at the factory. The wars in the Far East, Poland and Finland had almost exhausted the stocks of spare parts for the BT tanks, so even many of these minor repairs were not even possible. That and the production of these parts had more or less stopped, with factories focusing on the new T-34 and KV tanks instead of the BTs. But even if they had all these spares and the logistics system to distribute them, the Red Army's leadership had just been decapitated by Stalin's purges, so anyone with any authority was either incompetent, inexperienced, or both. The lack of functional vehicles was also disastrous for crew training. An assessment of the 564 tank drivers in the 5th Tank Division in April 1941 showed that 37% of them had less than 2 hours of driving experience, 36% had between 2 and 10 hours, and 27% had more than 10 hours. They didn't have the vehicles to train on, and the vehicles they did use were quickly worn out, notably the clutches from driver error. As a result of all these factors, the BT tanks were essentially wiped out when Germany invaded in June 1941. Mechanical issues, poor training, lack of preparation, and poor leadership doomed the Soviet tank forces. In the first 3 weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets lost 11,703 tanks. The Germans lost less than 500. If we look at the 12th Tank Division and the 7th Mechanized Corps, we get an idea of the chaos. These two units had 236 and 229 BT tanks respectively when fighting began. On July 7th, after just 2 weeks of fighting, the 12th had been reduced to 9. Following fighting in the second week of July, the 7th Corps had 6 tanks. This trend was happening across the front line. Despite all the work and innovation that went into the tank, and the fact it was actually quite a capable design that was, on paper, superior to many of the tanks it was facing, like the Panzer I, Panzer II, Panzer 35T, the BT tank force, at least in the West, had been completely wiped out within the first month of fighting. After all, how are you meant to conduct maneuver warfare when you are unprepared, poorly trained, poorly led, your tank urgently needs repairs, and you have no spare parts? The BT tanks and their crews had no real chance. There were pockets of success from individual vehicles, and when the BT tanks were in working order and properly organised, they did perform very well, proving to be at least as capable as the Panzer 38Ts used by the Germans. However, this was uncommon to say the least. But it's not all doom and gloom. The legacy of the vehicle is remarkable. The BT-7M was developed into the BT-20, which would evolve into the A-20, which would evolve into the A-32, which would then be adopted as the T-34. This new vehicle, using the same Christie suspension as the BT, would be one of the most important armoured vehicles of all time, and would help the Soviets rebuild their tank forces and move onto the offensive, taking the war into Germany and ending it. That, and it formed the basis for the T-44 and T-54, which solidified the design philosophy of the Soviet Union for decades to come. So next time you see a T-80 or a T-90, just remember the humble BT-2, a vehicle that I think deserves a lot more respect. Thank you very much for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy this, do subscribe down below and check out similar videos on Soviet interwar designs, the KV series, the IS series, and the IS-6. And thanks very much to my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel and making all this possible. Anyway, I'll see you all next time.